I am happy to introduce Jerusalem of the Mind in its fourth year. It is most rewarding that it has grown into such a popular, well-attended event. I was born in Palestine and then lived in Israel. And though my family emigrated to Canada, that part of the world and its fate has always held a special place in my heart. And so as ever, it is my firm belief that bringing enlightened minds together in meaningful and constructive dialogue, no matter how conflicting the perspectives, is a powerful way to help shed light toward understanding and peace.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Blue Metropolis International Literary Festival 2021 edition. We're here today for the Gabriel Safdie event, Jerusalem of the Mind, Narratives of Israel and Palestine. Thanks, as always, to Gabriel Safdie for sponsoring this event. It's an ongoing conversation that I've been lucky to be a part of for 3 years now. We appreciate it. And I also want to make a reminder to everyone, as you're listening to our various authors, that their books are all available through the Paragraph Bookstore. I know we're all saving a lot of money on haircuts and deodorant, so use that money to buy a couple extra books. I also want to start right off by acknowledging that we are broadcasting from Jojage, which is what the Ganyakgahaga call Montreal. This place has and continues to be a historical gathering place for many Indigenous peoples, and we're grateful to be a part of this long and proud history of creating and sharing stories on these lands. I've got some quick biographies of our panelists and our guests here today for you. It's an A-list panel because everybody's name starts with the letter A. To start with, Ayelet Gundar-Goshen is a writer, a clinical psychologist, and has worked a lot for the Israeli civil rights movement. She won Israel's prestigious Sapir Prize for her best debut, Waking Lions, her first novel, which has been published in 17 countries and was a New York Times notable book. Her latest book, which I happen to have right here, is The Liar. Hlehel, how's the pronunciation on that?
That's wonderful.
Okay. Hlehel has written a novel, Al Cirque, translated as The Circus, a collection of short stories called Stories in Time of Need, plays, and a few scripts for film and TV. He's also a two-time winner of the Al Katan Young Writer Award. Amjad Iraqi is an editor and writer at N72 magazine, an important Israeli magazine. He's also a policy analyst at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and was previously an advocacy coordinator at Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. His essays appear in the London Review of Books, The Guardian, Le Monde Diplomatique, and Palestine Square, among others. Ayelet Waldman is a New York Times bestselling author whose novels and essay collections have been published throughout the world. She's a co-creator of a Netflix show, Unbelievable, and has written about both microdosing and bad mothers. Not, I don't think, in the same book, but we'll see. She's also edited, of course, a great collection that we've all been taking a look at on the occupation called Kingdom of Olives and Ash, Writers Confront the Occupation. Okay. As an intro, I wanted to say that 2 years ago, I introduced the same panel, and I introduced it by talking about how Benjamin Netanyahu appears to have become an almost inevitable leader in Israel. He's kind of like the new Putin. He almost seems prime minister for life. That was 2 years ago, and now 2 years and 4 elections later, almost the exact same situation is there. I thought it was bizarre this year. There was an Israeli election, and literally nobody on my social feed, on my social news feeds, mentioned it. It was 3 days after the election when I woke up and I was like, wait, what happened in Israel? And of course, I checked, and basically the same thing as always. Netanyahu with a small group, he's going to somehow put together a coalition with far-right groups and ultra-Orthodox groups. And I thought it was bizarre that it's so common now that literally nobody on my social media feeds even commented about it. So again, it seems we're really stuck in some kind of a loop now. Now, there's a lot of reasons why Israel and Palestine are currently stuck in this loop without any kinds of progress. But today we're going to focus on the role of narrative, the political stories that we tell ourselves about this situation. Words themselves are flashpoints around this. Even terms like conflict or war, if you write like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian war, people will argue like it's not a conflict, actually it's not a war, it's an occupation. People debate terms obviously such as terrorism or resistance, And of course, the grenade that you can launch into any room such as this is the word boycott. The point I want to make is that in a way, the conflict over the territory itself also takes place on the battleground of language. Words, but also our larger narratives and stories, stories about history, stories about ancestors, stories about good, evil, suffering, and persecution. So our overall theme for today is kind of going to be, how do our stories keep us stuck? How do we shift some of these stories? And what's going to be the role of the writer in shifting these stories? That's our general theme. The first question I want to set out for everyone, and in a way this is prompted by Ayelet Gundar-Goshen's Guardian article. She wrote a great article on the secret to Netanyahu's success. I wanted to ask you, what are the stories that you think that politicians want us to believe? What are the stories politicians are telling, and how are these stories believed or taken up by the public in Israel, Palestine, and in the diaspora? Who wants to get our ball rolling? Amjad?
Sure, happy to. Hello, everyone, and it's really a pleasure to be on this panel with all of you. I mean, the question could be taken in many different ways, but one of the first things that kind of pops up for me when it comes to asking about politicians and their place in all these narratives for both Israelis and Palestinians is often how much the politicians try to assert themselves and lionize themselves in the national and political narratives of the people they're representing. So the way that you mentioned now, Netanyahu, one of the defining features of his rule over the past decade plus is essentially to make every aspect of Israeli politics around him. And it's to say that you cannot think about the future of Israel without thinking the future of me as an individual, and that the survival of the state is my survival. And this is a narrative that has worked very well for him, that some people do effectively buy it, some people have resigned themselves to it. And it's really why almost every element of state and society revolves around this individual. And and unfortunately, Israeli media, Israeli discourse has centered itself around that. Now, we also have the same thing actually in the Palestinian narrative and in politics. So this year, for example, there are scheduled to be Palestinian elections in the occupied territories. And even now, like the idea of political identity and the narratives that are being propagated today still very much center around who is going to take the top job, who is going to run for president, who is going to be the PLO chairman. And these are obviously very, important positions, but it shows the extent to which somehow the fate of the nation, the fate of the society revolves around these elite people. And we've had this historically with people like Yasser Arafat, even now it's Mahmoud Abbas, and now it's who's going to replace Mahmoud Abbas. And we end up losing sight of this wider system, this ecosystem of politics, of identity, of who gets to tell the political story and narrate the political struggles and directions of these societies. And so you see this very much in both respects by politicians in both societies, in my opinion.
Somebody else? Ayelet, actually, there was a component of your article in The Guardian where you talked about good versus evil that really got me thinking a fair bit. And I think you're in some ways you're talking about Netanyahu and narratives of good and evil. And I was really wondering about the role of good and evil in the stories that we tell ourselves. Anyways, perhaps you could say something about that.
I can think about it as an author, but I think in an even more basic way, I think about it as a person who is addicted to stories. And I see my children when they listen to a story. I have young children, and I see this need, or my mother when she goes to the room in the middle of the film, the first question would be, so who's the bad guy and who's the good guy, before she sits down on the sofa. And it's the same with my kids. And I think perhaps that's why Justice League and Marvel and DC Comics work so well, because we have this human urge to differentiate who are the bad guys, who are the good guys. And I think Netanyahu is really the best storyteller of our time, providing this narrative. It's a very simple world of ultimate evil versus ultimate good, with victims and monsters. And it's very clear who is the victim and who is the monster. And I think there is something very powerful in this sort of stories. It's almost as if I don't know, the evolution of the human soul turns us into this very clear stories where you can have one tribe facing another tribe. And Netanyahu is really an expert in creating tribes, the Israeli tribe versus the Palestinian tribes, and also inside the Israeli society, the very clear cut that we have into tribes today inside the Israeli society. And I think you could see it, for instance, in Passover, which we just had, in the story of Bechol Dor V'Dor Kamim Elenu Lechalotenu in Hebrew. Every generation, a new pharaoh comes to slaughter us all. And Netanyahu, in a series of speeches that he gave in Holocaust Memorial Days, he likes to talk about it. In Passover, he likes to talk about it. Every opportunity is a good opportunity to make this very clear link between Pharaoh, to Hitler, to Haj Amin al-Husseini, to the current Palestinian leadership. And I think there is something very appealing about these stories, because just like how my mom needs to know the good guys and the bad guys, and how my kids needs to know the good guys and the bad guys, I think there's something very appealing in the idea that we might sometimes be a victim as Jews, but we're always the right side. We're always the good side.
You know, it makes me think about in the United States, it is the precise dynamic that Trump used and continues to use, even though he's not in power, to consolidate power. This notion, this creation of the ultimate victim being the Christian, white, gun-owning, beleaguered American who's set upon by brown, gay, trans people. I mean, and it's a very consciously created narrative, and that sense of shared victimhood is what bonds these sectarian. You know, we really are in the United States in this kind of sectarian conflict now, which I think mimics really clearly what's going on in Israel. And all along, as I watched Trump, I thought, you know, Netanyahu is just a much smarter and sophisticated version of this. He's done this very effectively. And because he has no, because there are no term limits there, he will do it forever. But that narrative, the narrative of who is the greater victim, is, I think, what's so tragic about Palestine and Israel, and what makes it so intractable. And in my more gloomy days, I feel hopeless about it. It's so interesting because I think a lot about South Africa, and when I came into sort of my activist mind when I was a college student, and we were boycotting South Africa, and we were having anti-apartheid. We slept in tents out in the yard of our college, like the football field, in order to get the university to divest from South Africa, which they did. I don't know why. Us sleeping on the football field helped, but it did. And what's so interesting to me there is that version of who is the greater victim, it's just, you saw that there too. You had this domineering white minority that presented a narrative of we could be murdered at any moment by these black hordes. And so you see it there, you see it in the United States, you see it in Palestine, and it is that narrative is the galvanizing, uniting force. And the leaders who are most effective at creating that narrative and convincing others to, walk behind that banner are the ones who are the most destructive. I mean, I think Netanyahu is right to hearken back to the Holocaust. I don't think he understands just how like Hitler he is in his use of that victim narrative.
I mean, yeah. I mean, Alad, do you have what's your take on good and evil? Is it possible to see this conflict outside of good and evil? What's the role of good and evil when we think about it?
Yeah. Well, basically, I think like the huge difference between us as storytellers and politicians, that we tend to tell a very complicated and layered stories and characters. And I think politicians tend to tell a story that is one-dimensional story, like with good and bad. And the second thought of this is like we use the term narrative, but we forget. I think we forget that it's a way to say that there is no truth. Narrative, it's just a version of a truth or a story. So basically, the term narratives it is blurring the truth. Like I can have my narrative about the Israeli elections or what happened in 1967, 1948, and it's legitimate that I tell my narrative and the Israeli Jew will tell his narrative, and we are all happy. But what happened with the truth, you know? And I think the narrative way of seeing the world is very good and benefits for the politicians, because if there is no truth, and we are post-history and post-truth and post-modernist, so everyone can tell his own narrative, and it's fine with everybody. This is my main problem with this term, and I think the politicians are making a huge use of it. So it's not about right and wrong. It's not about evil and and good. Like even Palestinians who were suffering like more than 100 years from this conflict, and we suffered a lot by losing our homeland. We still have some, bad people among us. That in every liberation movement, you do bad things, and you have bad politicians. And among all these complications, I think that we are missing the truth, and it's being so clear now with King Bibi, and what is happening in the Israeli politics, and what is happening now in the Palestinian politics. Like me, myself, I think like the Palestinian election is a disaster. Like we are selling the world an illusion that we are a state, and we have a president, and we have a elected government, and we have ministers. But excuse my French, it's just a bullshit. Like even Mahmoud Abbas can't go to Amman without Israeli permission. So it's just an illusion. It's like collaborating with the Israeli narrative that there is a state on the road, or some maybe upcoming state in the coming 50 years. But it's all a lie, and we are collaborating with that. So me, myself, I don't know even what is bad and wrong now in this context. It's very complicated for me.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, it actually reminds me of something we're seeing more and more in the news media. What we see now is this the idea of presenting things balanced. And so they'll present one person's opinion or narrative and the other person's opinion or narrative. I mean, that partly results from the fact that they just don't have the money to do anything. Opinions are really, really cheap. But I saw someone post something recently, like what's actually needed is actually investigative journalism, right? Actually go there, not just like, let's listen to your side and this side, but let's actually have an investigative journalist go in and unearth the truth, as you said. We're a bit in a rough spot because so many news outlets don't have the actual money to do extensive investigative reporting anymore.
In a sense, that's what we were trying to do with, not investigative reporting, right? When we sent all of these, when you call these writers to the West Bank and Gaza, and when, Allah and others came from Palestine, from Israel, the goal there was, people said to me, well, aren't you trying to get balance? And I said, I'm not trying to get balance. I'm just trying to invite people to look and see, and they will write their story. They will write what they see. They won't write, it's not a polemic. It's simply, these are storytellers who know how to tell stories, and they're going to look at what's around them, and they're going to find a story to tell. And I felt no requirement for balance, not because I had an overtly political agenda, although probably, to be honest, I did, but because I think balance, like you, is bullshit. I think it's like, there is truth, right? And if you're standing at the Kalandia checkpoint, what you see there is, that's the truth of your, that context of those people and the situation. It is objectively, truthfully miserable. Now you could talk about why, and you could talk about the Intifada, and you could talk about blah, 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 but like just I do think Allah really put it well, and it's kind of blown my mind with this notion that we've allowed narrative and perceptions of narrative to be manipulated, and we've lost a sense of prioritizing honesty and truth.
I must say, I mean,
it's true in Israel, it's true in Palestine, it's true in America, it's true everywhere, but that makes it worse, not better, because even that line, like, oh, this is how it's all over the world, it's like somehow a way to absolve the underlying power structure. But
I mean, this is one of the things whereby like the checkpoint example, like you said, Ayelet, it's for the Palestinian, it's obviously the symbol of pure oppression. But a lot of people in Israel, for example, see this as a justified system of security, and there's no persuading them sometimes out of that narrative because they're coming from this point of view and the storytelling. Now, I think oftentimes for responsibilities for us as writers, as journalists, etc., our party are these different audiences. Oftentimes, these third parties, especially writing from here, we're often trying to shape people's opinions abroad. That, okay, if you're getting this market of different perspectives, you can sort of, there's a difference between trying to say, like, we want to provide this empathy, this way for you to see the world and see this land through the lens of particular people. Then I think one of the biggest responsibilities that we have is it's kind of explain what are the principles that we want them to take from understanding this. So, okay, I understand that a Palestinian sees a checkpoint like this, and let's say I understand that an Israeli sees a checkpoint like this. Now, I as a reader, let's say I as this kind of third-party reader, what am I supposed to take away from these? And here I think this also comes back to something that was mentioned, but but for me, a key part of all this is understanding and laying out power dynamics. Like, there is truth to every narrative, but I think the stronger truth is in the power dynamics. Who holds physical power? Who holds political power? Who has the most platforms, the most voice? These are almost like tangible things that one can observe. And again, you can understand the world through those people's eyes, but the main thing is that if we understand that these are not all exactly at the same rate, then to whom should we be giving more priority to? To whom should we be trusting as credible narrators of what's happening on the ground? Bibi can shout that he's a victim from the rooftops, but we use our brains to know that there's no way that he's a victim. He is a man with high political power. And so this is a challenge that I think that falls on many of us as writers, whereby how do you present that power context? How do you present that power structure in order to take these at different weights? Because it's like you're saying, Joseph, you can't treat these as both sides. Because you might try to have this equality in voices, but you're not achieving that equity in the voices. And this is a challenge that comes in, I think, in all our writing projects.
Yeah. If I may add to Amjad and Ayelet, and I think truth, it's about details. Like, you can't deal with truth without details and facts. And I think the world, with this atomic explosion of data that we are experiencing since like 20 years ago, is exhausted with details. Like, I think that people don't want to know the truth. They don't want to know all the details about like settlers or occupation. Even about 1948, like, we Palestinians ourselves, almost we forgot about 1948. Everybody talks about 1967. And this is a disaster. Like, people, they don't have the strength, the power, and the will to hear all the details. And that's why narratives control the discourse now abroad and everywhere, even in Palestine and Israel. The second thing, I think, like, it's what Amjad said about power. I recall all the time what Mahmoud Darwish, the late great poet, said to Godard in his documentary film. It's called Our Music, if I recall it right. He said, like, Palestinians, we are so cursed and blessed that we were occupied by Jews. Otherwise, nobody would hear about us. Like, the wild war entrance in Palestine and Israel conflict, it's because we are facing the Jews, not because we are Arab Palestinians. Like, the Arabs were killed like ages and ages. Nobody care about us, like Africa. But because we have this kind of enemy that is so sexy and all the guilt of the Holocaust, and the Jews are very important people in the world. That's why we are focused in Palestine, not because of Palestinians, because of the Jews. That's why we are cursed and blessed being the enemies of the Jews. So kind of like satire way, we are using this power of the other narrative to tell our narratives. So it's hilarious sometimes, you know, when I think about it. Like, I mean, I'm taking advantage of the strength of the Jews upon the history just to tell my narrative. Otherwise, nobody would hear me. Who's asking what is happening in Iraq or Yemen? You know, nobody cares. Like, the tragedy in Iraq is like triple the tragedy of Palestine, because the people are killed like 100 people a day. It's a disaster, but nobody is talking about them there. So it's very complicated. It's about soft power and hard power. It's about like complicity of narratives and who are you dealing with. And it's exhausting for us. But, you know, at the end of the day, maybe we are taking advantage of being like the enemy of the Jews at the end of the day.
I mean, this is very the way that narratives fold onto one another. I mean, I would say that in addition to being the Jews, that Israel, Jerusalem, we actually talked about this in one of the other Blue Mets, Jerusalem is such a symbol in the imagination sort of throughout the world, and certainly for Christian Europe. So in some ways, I would say that some of the attention that comes is from the sort of mythical status of Jerusalem for thousands of years since the Crusades, as that's held a fascination for European Christendom. But I love this idea that narratives.
Can I just add one thing too? I mean, I think again, every time Allah speaks, I'm like, yes. But I mean, I think also it is that kind of the sort of the position of Jews as, you know, powerful. I mean, like, you know, we always joke like we actually do control the media. You see the New York, but it's also because of the kind of vitriol and loathing that Jews experience on the other hand, right? I mean, that the Jews hold this very strange position in society where we are at once powerful, you know, that there's no denying it, in terms of culture, in terms of media, yes, and also politically in different places, but also we are reviled in this way that we forget even too. So like you see these outbursts of anti-Semitism that have nothing to do with Palestine and Israel, but that are like deeply rooted in the European psyche. And I think that does it both facilitates the sort of what Allah is talking about why people care about this conflict with this occupation, this brutality more than others. But at the same time, it you know, there are these two battling forces, because on the one hand, it garners so much more attention in part because of the, you know, this history of anti-Semitism. And at the same time, there's this, you know, what other group can, every American politician has to go through this rigmarole of talking about their support for Israel. Why? They don't go through a rigmarole talking about their support for, you know, I don't know what, Switzerland or Burkina Faso. I mean, they don't give a shit. So, but like, you cannot get elected in this country unless you go and, you know, lay yourself open to AIPAC, and, you know, like even Bernie Sanders even succumbed to that kind of that need to pay obeisance. So it is really interesting, and it's it is. If I could figure out why, I think I don't think I'm alone among progressive Jews and just wishing that nobody cared about us, because, you know, enjoying the power is as destructive as the, you know, as the anti-Semitism. And I think, you know, it's I don't know. But anyway, I think there are like two competing strains for that. But yeah, at least they're writing about it in the New York Times.
I want to throw one more thing out there as well. I think some of the attention it gets, it's true. But I actually think that there's a lot of people out there. There's a long history of Europe blaming Jews. and a long history of Europe blaming Jews for various problems all the way to the global level. And in some ways, there's a big precedent for, and there's a market for talking about the Jews being to blame. So I actually also think that in a weird way, one of the reasons why Israel gets so much disproportionate attention is that for some people out there also, the story of the Jews kind of being bad or doing something wrong has a little bit of traction as well.
Absolutely. And then on the flip side of that, the Jews, and particularly Jews in power in Israel, get, use that history of loathing and blame to absolve themselves of the very real crimes that they're committing, from Israel's Genesis. I was just thinking about this thing. I was talking to Ayelet about this because she wrote this really beautiful book about Europeans founding a kibbutz, and it's a book that I just read. But my father recently died, just a month and a half ago, I think, and he was. The narrative that I experienced, growing up in my house, was this story about this kind of romance of the founding of the state of Israel, right? So as a result of the Holocaust, my father moved to Israel with a bunch of his young Canadian fellow Jews, and they created from dirt and sand a kibbutz. They made the desert bloom, right? And in his stories, there was the Palestinian village, the Arab village, to be clear, the Arab village next door, and they had this kind of lovely relationship, right? They bought their pitot from there. And that's like the story, that kind of story, that romantic tale that I grew up on. And it really was a story. The only time my father ever really communicated with his children was to tell those stories. And then in the 80s, was it the 80s, guys? When the kind of Israeli new historians came out and said, that's not exactly what happened in 1948. People didn't just say, oh yeah, we'll leave our homes. They were driven out at gunpoint. And my father suddenly said, oh yeah, that's also part of our story. Like, that's actually something we did. Me personally.
This is kind of a good example of, I think, what Allah is advocating, which is like you get all these narratives built up. And I love this idea that narratives are on the side of politicians. We'll kind of come back to that. And I was also thinking about something that Amjad said about, you were talking about particular kind of narratives. One of the things that might get in the way of our seeing the truth is the power of certain narratives. So I kind of wanted to ask a general question to you guys, and we'll go on later to think about what kinds of stories we might want to write. But before we do that, what do you think are the stories about Israel and Palestine that you most think need to be changed? I know that Amjad has recently written something about the myth of Rabin as the peacemaker and of the Oslo Accord. So I thought I wouldn't mind just doing a quick round and kind of asking each of you, what do you think is the myth or story that most needs to be kind of broken or busted around the story? Did you want to start off, Amjad?
Actually, I'd love to give the mic to our fellow Ayelet. Actually, she hasn't spoken well, so I'm happy to start with her.
Yeah. I can think about two different myths. One is that I grew up upon. It's a Jerusalem myth from Naomi Shemer's song, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold, where she said, Chazarnu el borot hamayim kikar hashuk rika, which in English would say, we came back and saw the shuk was empty. And I think for years, this constructed the Israeli Jewish collective memory of Jerusalem as if the city was completely empty, as if the entire country was like the sleeping beauty, which was lying there sleeping for 2,000 years, waiting for the Zionist macho men to come and kiss her and wake her up to life. I think it was so deeply embedded in high school, in elementary school, in kindergarten, in holidays that had nothing to do with this, but were adopted by the Zionist movement. So like agricultural holidays about the spring and how the country starts to blossom became holidays about how the Zionism takes this country that used to be, as Ayelet said, desert and sand, and creates life in it. And I think it's amazing because I walked as a little girl in so many Arab villages, where you can see the figs and you can see, you know, everything that grew there. You know, you can still see the olive trees. You can still, it wasn't empty. Jerusalem wasn't empty for one day in the last 2,000 years. But I think this is a very powerful narrative we have, the idea of Am lelo eretz, le'eretz lelo am, people without a country to a country that has no people. And I think this is really about chosen blindness, the idea that how can you say that there are no people? It's like today when you look in Google Maps, when I wrote Waking Lions, I write about the Israeli desert. So I looked in Google Maps at the Israeli desert, and back then you saw Beersheba, and down in the south you saw Eilat, and the rest was just few scattered kibbutzes. And when you drive there, I was working back then in the Israeli civil rights movement, so we worked with Arab Bedouin villages, which are unrecognized by the Israeli state. So you drive there and you have Google Maps opened, and in reality, it's not an empty desert, it's full of people. But in the maps, there's nothing. And I think that's why I thought that the book, that Ayelet and Michael's book was so important, because it was saying that things are happening here and we can't choose to be blind to them forever. We have to write about them. That would be one narrative. But if I have to be operative and I'm thinking about the most powerful narrative that has to be changed, is the narrative that I think every Israeli can say if you wake him up in the middle of the night, it would be הערבים רוצים לזרוק את כולנו לים. The Arab wants to throw all of us into the sea. And I think this is something which, as long as that's not considered to be the biggest fear, but considered to be the biggest truth, I think nothing can change here. Because if I'm thinking that people want to throw me into the sea, there's no way I'll be willing to try and lower my defenses and negotiate. You don't negotiate peace with people who want to throw you back into the sea.
And those words are so powerful that even, you know, my family left Israel when I was 2. Growing up in the United States and Canada, that I know that's not true. And yet in my body, when I hear those words, they feel true to me, to someone who has devoted so much of her time and energy and focus to battling against this fundamental injustice. So, you know, that the power of that indoctrination is boggling.
It's boggling. And I think it relates to what we said earlier about good and evil. I was thinking about, when I think about American cinema, sometimes I think, when I teach in classes, sometimes that almost one of the most common themes in American cinema is actually legitimization of violence. So you think of those Liam Neeson movies where it's like, you know, somebody kidnaps his daughter to sell them into sex slavery in Eastern Europe. And then of course the whole thing gears you up to eventually to take pleasure in watching him kill a bunch of Bulgarians, or however those movies play out. And the way American cinema is really, really designed to prepare you to legitimize kind of violence. And in some ways, this myth is very much there, I think, and also functions to legitimize violence.
Yeah, it's Amjad turn. Shukran. I think that the equation of a land without people for a people without land, it was a huge trap for us as Palestinians. I'm in my minority here because I discuss with our Palestinian fellows all the time, it's a trap. Don't fall into this trap. Think of Palestine before 1948, that from up the north until Eilat, the far south, think that there was only 10 people and 2 camels, even though nobody has the right to kick you out of your land. This is not a discussion that we have to prove that we were there, Jaffa was great, and we had Haifa and Akka and Jerusalem. We don't have to prove to anyone in the world that there was a people and we deserve to stay in our land. And just because the Zionist movement said that it's a land without people, we should defend ourselves and prove it for everybody. It's a trap. And the other side, on the one side, you need to tell the world really what happened there. But on the other side, you put yourself in this corner to prove that you were there and you were a vibrant people and we have our heritage and literature and politics and whatever. So it's a kind of really a deep trap, because I don't find myself a defender for to prove to the world, to Western world especially, that we were there. We were there. It's like, it's a fact. So if you don't know it, just go and read your history, your book history, okay? And I think we are losing in this battle, because in a way, one of the myths that the Zionist movement just really sold the world, that we deserve this piece of land for two reasons: because of the Holocaust and because of the Bible. Like, you can't argue with the Bible, for God's sake. It's God who promised this land for these people. And I think we didn't manage this very well as Palestinians. And this is one of the myths that we should deal with it. Like, I know that most of the Palestinians and most of the Jews and most of the Christians in the world, they believe in God. Like, they really believe that there is God, and this Bible and Quran and the New Testament are real words. Now, for me, as one, he doesn't believe in that, not in God, neither in God and neither in Bible or Quran. It's very hard to convince people that there's no God and he didn't promise this land for anyone. So it's a kind of lost battle. And like, Joseph, when you ask about this question in your mail, I thought, like, this is a huge myth. It's the religion, and you can't fight it in any way. I'm not saying that we all should not raise our hands and that's it. It's a lost case, but it's extremely hard to fight God and His Bible. It's extremely hard. And put aside this, you have the Holocaust effect. So in a way, this is the myth. This is the original, fact that you have to deal with it. It's not a promised land for anyone. It's a land. It was occupied like more than 45 times in the last 5,000 years. It's a land of battles, and the who has the weapons and the power can control it. So it's a very painful for me, like, to think about this myth that, and I know deeply inside, especially today in like 21st century, that the religion is so powerful now among Jews and Muslims to convince people to let this aside. So I'm really confused about it, like how you can convince people to let aside, like to not to talk about God and the Bible and Quran. It's frustrating, but we should think about it a lot. This is the original myth.
I mean, to continue on this, like, even beyond the religious discourse and the extent to which religion is manifested in the understanding here, even if you take just the political story or the political context that's being attributed to Israel-Palestine, it's that, okay, even if you don't believe in the idea of that the Bible gave this land to the Jews and whatnot, but it's the idea that Jews require a state of their own, and specifically in their historical homeland, in order to survive and thrive, etc. Now, obviously, it's a very complex kind of history and narrative, etc. But what this has basically resulted in, and I find this especially like in Europe and in North America, whereby people have bought into the idea that now we need to grant an exception for a state that explicitly defined itself on its ethnic, racial, religious identity. That at a time where we're literally trying to push back against ethno-nationalism throughout the world, somehow even the most, equality-minded American politician can still say, except for Israel, that we need to grant this exception to this political idea that there is a group of people, an ethnic group of people, who deserve more privileges than the other. Like, this is a myth that continues to this day. And in turn, a resultant myth is that the idea of equality, in Palestinian society, we've been trying to promote this idea of, either full national equality or state for all its citizens. Like, that is literally like the main term we've been using. And when you use it here in Israel, for most Jewish Israelis, that idea, the very word equality, means annihilation. It means the death of the Jewish state. It means a death of Zionism. It means a death of Jewish privilege. So this political myth, which has now said that we need to keep protecting this, ethno-national exception here, is very destructive. You can put the religion aside, you can even put the land without a people aside, but the idea is that, you can have many Jewish Israelis who say, all right, we accept the responsibility for what happened in 1948, but the status quo, the power structures that are in place need to remain the same. And you're asking Palestinians, and even like Ala and myself, who are Palestinians who, whose ancestors were able to stay on this side of the Israeli border, we have Israeli citizenship, but even that citizenship is not enough to give us equality. There are entire systems and structures of laws and policies, social thought, the way we're talked about, the way we're described, which is designed to tell us, Palestinian citizens, that you have to accept your inferiority and that you either deserve your inferiority or you need to make the sacrifice because we need to provide a homeland for the Jewish people. And I must say, a lot of people like me and a lot of people throughout our past 3-4 generations of Palestinians here, some of us bought into that. And it takes a while to unlearn this process. Like, why should I compromise my equality? Why should I compromise my history, my belonging to this land in order to provide this exception to another people? You can have equality. You can have a homeland here without having to assert your superiority and privilege. And this, for me, is a fundamental struggle. It's a fundamental struggle, of the politics of the conflict. It's the way that also the narratives operate, whereby if we as storytellers are also reinforcing that structure, whereby it's just about, managing both sides, not understanding that if we understand there's an oppressor and an oppressed, if we believe in equality everywhere else, but not equal equality here, then we are hypocritical. And we are creating a contradiction, and we are reinforcing those international power structures which keep Palestinians inherently unequal, inherently occupied, inherently refugees, because we are supposed to pay the price for that.
I mean, when you talk about the idea that there's an exceptionalism to Israel as an ethno-nationalist state, I mean, I immediately thought back to like my dad and the story that I inherited, which was just like, they've come to slaughter us over and over and over. In every generation, someone will come, and there has to kind of be this one place where we're kind of safe. And, as a 10-year-old kid, I for sure kind of bought that. I was like, yeah, people are coming out to kill us. So as a 10-year-old kid, I really felt like, actually, I kind of feel good that there's one state that does have an ethnic exception to it as the Jewish state. Now, obviously, for all the reasons you've said, it's a huge problem, and I agree with everything you've said. But I wanted to, in some ways, it shows us, I think, the power of this after story of the Holocaust and the power, in some ways, of the trauma of kind of persecution. So I kind of wanted to turn on for a question for Ayelet, who's also a clinical psychiatrist, or is it psychoanalyst?
Psychologist.
Okay, psychologist. I read an interview that I thought was fantastic with you, where you were talking about, you diagnosed Israel as suffering from PTSD, as a post-traumatic disorder. And then for recovery, what you recommended was, I'm quoting you here if that's okay, continuously and patiently reminding Israel where it is now, that the present and the past are not the same thing. Could you say a little bit more about that?
I'll say a little bit more and then I'll contradict what I wrote there. But I think back there it was, I kept feeling when I look at Israeli politics, it reminds me of something that I see in my clinic. It reminds me of this situation when somebody, and it goes back to what I said about narratives, like somebody comes with a narrative which is so powerful. The idea that the war or the accident or the sexual abuse is happening right now, which is a big symptom of PTSD, is like re-experiencing the trauma as if it is happening right now. So if I was in a car accident 10 years ago, I would experience it as if it's happening to me right now. And then I would shout at the person next to me who did nothing wrong, because for me, he is the same driver from 10 years ago. And I thought about how much fear and anger this creates, because with PTSD patients, one of the things that you see is how fast fear transforms into aggressiveness. I think you see it with animals, you see it with kids, and you see it with grown-ups. Like how fast the idea that I'm intimidated and then I attack. And many times this patient can get into very difficult situations because they attack so aggressively because they feel threatened by a trauma that actually happened long, long ago. And what you do in therapy, and I started thinking about Israel is quite the same, because I thought Well, the truth is that for generation, even before the Holocaust, we were the victims. We were executed for years, for centuries in terrible ways. So we have, in a way, every good reason to fear that we will be executed one more time, and that if we will lay down our defenses for just 1 minute, we will be thrown back into the sea, because we were thrown into the sea so many times before. But then again, you think this completely stops us from acknowledging that, as Amjad said, the power differences. We are no longer the minority, that we are no longer the victim, that we are now the oppressors, that we are now the aggressors. And I think when it comes to the debate inside the Israeli society, then I think my job is to try to keep specifying the differences, to acknowledge the fear, and to acknowledge that, to validate the fear, because I think if you don't validate the fear and if you don't acknowledge the fear, you lose your listener. You lose your listener. So I think it's first about validation and acknowledgement of the fear, of the pain, of everything. But then, and this is where I relate to what Ala said, after you acknowledge the fear, you have to face reality. You have to face the facts. You have to face that the past is not the past, that the victim of the past is now causing other victims. And if you don't do that, then your empathy is being abusive, because you prevent the patient, or you prevent the country from facing who we are right now and what we're doing right now. But to contradict what I said there, when I said that you have to patiently remind, I think maybe this is something that I can say, sitting in Tel Aviv, being very privileged, that I can say that we should patiently remind. I think if I was sitting in the Palestinian occupied territories, I wouldn't be so patient in reminding. If I was the person that, the driver gets, a bomb in his head because he reminded the car accident from 10 years ago, and he wasn't involved in this car accident, he didn't cause that car accident, I might not be so patient. And I might feel that even if this person is suffering from PTSD, this person right now is making me suffer.
I want to do a round. I want to move now to thinking about what kind of stories that we can write. We're at a writers' festival, and you guys are writers in a variety of different genres, whether it's documentary, literature, or journalism, or fiction. I'm kind of curious to kind of do a full go around and hear from you. Really, what kind of stories do you think we need now if we're thinking about changing the story? Now, I know that Ala, I wrote one thing where you were talking about memory, and you were saying how for a younger generation of Palestinians, they don't actually have immediate stories. Those stories have turned into memories. I know you're also, I think I was told you run a website that has a lot of LGBTQ stories as well. I know that for this book here, for the Kingdom of Ash that Ayelet put out, I know that it's a not-for-profit book, and that I noticed that all part of the proceeds, or half the proceeds, went to Breaking the Silence, which is a group that had a pretty big impact on me. It's a group of soldiers, and essentially what they do is present testimonies of their own experiences as soldiers in the occupied territories. I did one of the tours with them a few, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago now or something like that. It had a profound effect on me. So I do think there's a moment where those kinds of stories can have a profound effect. They don't get told that often. Breaking the Silence is really under assault in Israel in a variety of ways when it comes to their funding, which is too bad, because I almost feel like those are some of the most important stories to get out there. I know, Ayelet, you've also written about refugees of a couple different kinds, I think, coming to Israel. So there's a bunch of examples you've all given of these things. And I think when we think about the stories that are a problem that we tell ourselves that keep us stuck, what are the stories we can tell to shift things around? Amjad, would you want to start off?
I actually think Ayelet Waldman's ready to go, so go for it, Ayelet.
Okay. I'm going to disappoint you, Joseph. I don't know how much my faith in the power of storytelling has been pretty well shaken. I don't know that as novelists, as fiction writers, certainly, that it can. I used to think that that fiction was the only way that you could create true empathy, that you could live in the head of someone different from yourself and actually understand. And it was this fountain of possibility. I just don't know if I believe it anymore. First of all, because nobody reads. And second of all, because people will read and they'll have empathy, and then it doesn't seem to ever change their worldview, which is kind of, I know it's a bleak thought, but it is sort of heartbreaking. But I don't, where I am now is I don't care if it is not useful. The only way I can live with myself as someone who writes fiction and makes fictional television is if I do work that matters to me and that has a political point of view, an overtly political point of view. And if it doesn't do anything, it just doesn't do anything. So for example, one of the television shows I'm developing, which I'm sure no one will put on the air, but I don't care, it takes place in oh my God, the name of it just ran out of my, this is what happens when you're over 50, warning people. The prison where so many Palestinians end up being, prison in the occupied territories. What's the name of the big prison where the courts are? Which is
Ofer.
God. Oh, writing a show about it. So I'm developing a show set in Ofer prison about a young Palestinian kid and a young Jewish kid who actually both come from America. So they're American and they find themselves, one is the jailer and one is the jailed. And do I think that's going to make like some massive movement of empathy and compassion around the world that you're going to see for the first time the injustices of Ofer prison? No. Orange is the New Black didn't make anybody care about women in prison. They just cared about that show. But I don't think it matters to me personally. Like this is what I know how to do. So I'm just going to keep doing it. And I'm going to count on people who know how to do the actual on the ground activism more effectively to do that too. And maybe we all just link arms and fight the losing battle together, or maybe someone with a kind of optimistic worldview can, there's got to be a Martin Luther King in somewhere who can reject my pessimism and struggle forward and make change despite the insurmountable nature of the problem.
Well, we've got a couple combo writers. Oh, go ahead, Amjad.
No, I hope it don't mind if I respond to it. So I'm no Martin Luther King, but I'm almost happy to differ with you actually on this. I would say, as much as it can feel like, I can't believe I'm saying this with my own sort of like, pessimistic optimism on things, but these stories do matter and they are having an effect. They may not be fast enough. They may not have the immediacy, but I myself, and it's not just about like my work, but the kind of work that I've seen being done in the past decade, even 2 decades, where we are today on discussions and understanding of Israel-Palestine is not where it was 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now, in one sense, things got worse, but there's still this camp that is, in fact, is in fact understanding more, that is starting to take different sides. And for me, speaking as a journalist, one of my main priorities, or one of my understandings, in the cynical take of opinion shaping and trying to shape public understanding, is knowing that I can never get everyone onto my side, so to speak. The goal is not to make everyone use the same words that you do, completely agree with all your politics. It's just not going to happen. But for me, at least, there are 2 things that usually guide me, at least. The first one is to at least make certain audiences doubt their beliefs. Like, it's one thing to persuade, it's another to just make them doubt what they think is right, what they think is truth. And one of the biggest ways that you see this actually is among, for example, American Jews, Canadian Jews, who are understanding Israel-Palestine in a way that their previous generations could not. And it starts with doubt. It starts with doubt about why is our community often propagating this narrative that we have to, do so much for Israel, identify so much with the Jewish state. And there's a crack that's starting to emerge. And it's important to keep that up, because it makes people question these narratives. It makes people question stories that entrap them in a political system which, if they knew more, they wouldn't want to be a part of. So that for me is a huge part of it. That already is a big success. So I encourage that on one level. And the other important thing, I think, at least another guiding principle, again in the journalistic realm, but it's to just give the microphone to those who didn't get it, who weren't allowed to have a platform, who weren't allowed to have a voice. Unfortunately, so much of Israel-Palestine, and I'm seeing this especially now in the media, so much of Israel-Palestine is talked about without Palestinians. The number of articles you see every single week that are written by non-Palestinians about Palestinians is immense. And this is not to say, obviously, that non-Palestinians can't write about it. But when there is such a huge imbalance, and also who is the more credible, or the more praised writer and author and narrator of the Palestinian experience or the Palestinian story, and it tends to be like a white American, so on and so forth. If that's the dominant storyteller, then we have a problem. They can be there, but that becomes the first question that you have to ask. It's like, who is telling the story? And are enough Palestinians being able to say it? Speaking as on the Palestinian side of it, if you're not a Palestinian telling the Palestinian story, then how are you telling the story? If, for example, I often see all these sort of news reports and where they'll often interview the Palestinian villager whose land is being expropriated. They'll take the Palestinian victim who's on the ground, the family member, the shepherd, or whatnot. And then the expert, like the NGO expert, the academic, will tend to be Jewish Israeli, or like a foreign analyst. And so there also becomes this sort of divide, even in the way that we speak about Palestinians as those who experience it and tell it just through their eyes, but Palestinians are not can also articulate it in a large intellectual, or even political way. So these are even like the little pieces of you can see it in so many articles in that respect. Now I can't speak for fiction and so on, but these are these little things whereby if you're not Palestinian, how are you talking about Palestinians? And and then what are you doing after you've written your article, after you've written your book, after you've written your essay? If you're going on a book tour, or if you're going on a bunch of webinars, or these speaking events, how often are you talking about the Palestinians and not about yourself? How often are you bringing on a Palestinian to speak with you, and not to just take all the attention for yourself? And it's not to say that one has to do this every single time, but these are the questions that need to be asked. And this for me is one of those core dynamics, which again cracks a lot of belief systems, and it allows those who were silenced for too long to be able to assert their voice in spaces where they must be asserted. And the hope is that in the long term, that will have a positive impact.
Fantastic, Amjad. So good, so good. I'm getting time prompts. We're getting close. So I want to give Ayelet another couple minutes to say, and then I'm going to give the wrap up. Stories that we need to tell, or summaries. Ayelet, do you want to be penultimate?
I must say first that it was very important for me to listen to you speak right now, so thank you. I will say something not as an author, but as a mother, because I thought about it quite a lot. We just had the Israeli Independence Day, and just a day before that, the Israeli Memorial Day. And I have a 4-year-old boy, and I thought quite a lot about how can I talk with him about this day. So I didn't think of myself as an author in the last few days. I thought of myself as a storyteller through my child. And I thought, I'm thinking about breaking the silence. These are kids that grow up thinking that all the Arabs wants to throw us into the sea, and then they go to the army, and then something happens, and then they tell their stories. And I thought, I want to tell my child the stories that will prevent him from going there in the first place. I don't want him to go there and then tell the story of what happened. I want to try to tell him stories that will make him, even though he's growing up here inside the Israeli education system, to doubt the stories that he hears at school and to make different choices, not when he's 20, but when he's 16, when he's 17, when he's 18. So I'm thinking about our job as storytellers, but not necessarily to the public, but to our friends or to our children, or to the people around us. And how often do we get the opportunity to try and change somebody's mind? Or with my little boy, it's not like I thought about in the Memorial Day. I thought he doesn't know yet. He doesn't really know that he's Jewish. He doesn't know that the teacher in school, which is Arabic, is like his enemy in 20. He doesn't know any of it yet. And he'll have to find out one day. But maybe by the time he finds out about it, it could be it could be a different narrative, or it could be a more accurate truth.
Allah, you want last word? Are there any stories or stories to
I
be
will try
told?
not to be so philosophic. Well, I have extremely mixed feelings about my role as a writer toward my people. Like, if you are a son of a culture and people that have their struggle, political struggle, everybody expects from you to be the what we call in Arabic the tribe poet. You have to defend your tribe. You have to speak the language of and the terms and the history of your tribe. Now, I think writers basically are very lonely and weak people that they are trying to tell stories basically. And I think one of the important mission of any writer in his society is just to tell the subconscious of his people, to put the right words for their thoughts. Like ordinary people, they are not writers. They can't find the proper words. And I think the strength of Mahmoud Darwish and Emil Habibi and this great writer Ghassan Kanafani, they managed to find the proper words for our thoughts and pains. And I think it's a very tough mission. So basically you have to be honest with yourself. I always like to quote Albert Camus, who said once, like, we writers, we tell a lie in order to say the truth. Basically, we managed to, to have these characters and places and locations and scenes and plots, whatever, mixed with lies and truth, with research and imagination. And it's very complicated to be the tribe poet if you are sincere and honest with yourself as a writer. Like for myself, I want so much to write a story about the cannabis plant that I'm growing now. But it's not correct. It's not politically correct for Palestinians to read this now. Like, I'm portraying the expectations of Palestinian people of me. You should be now writing our pain and our narrative and our stories. And at the end, at the bottom, like at the end of the day, and this is the most important thing for me, any story should be interesting for me as a writer in order to write it. I won't write a story of demolished village if it's not interested for me, even it's a Palestinian village. So it's a conflict between me as a person, as a man who has to work and feed his children, and think all the time of stories and ideas and characters, and to be honest to his occupation, I write. And on the other hand, there are the huge expectation of people. We want to hear you talking about Palestinians and the lost Palestine, the lost paradise. But how can I bring into books the lost paradise, the lost Palestine, when I'm so miserable and I'm so weak and like sometimes I'm so speechless? So it's a tense situation, and sometimes I'm so frustrated that, like, for the last 8 years I can't finish my new novel. And what kind of a writer who can speak for his people, who can finish his, sorry for my French, fucking novel? So I don't know. Sometimes in this very sophisticated panel, sometimes the truth is like, really, I don't know.
Wow. I mean, unfortunately, I'm getting time prompts here. That's such a poignant moment to end at, but we have to move along. I wish we could continue over a glass of wine somewhere, but not possible at this moment.
I had my arak, so it's all right.
Okay. Thank you so much, Amjad, Ayelet, and Allah. It's been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate all the words you said. A lot of great points are on the table here. I want to thank Gabriel Safdie for sponsoring our event again. I want to thank Blue Met and remind our viewers that books can be bought at Paragraph. Thank you all so much, and I hope we all get a chance to meet in person one day.
Thank you all.
And thank you, Blue Met.